Hello and welcome to my Christmas in July event. My name is Sheila Johnson and I want to talk to you today about my book Waireka, which I've written under my pen name of Sheila Donald. Now Waireka is an odd name for a book because it's Maori and it means sweet waters. It's set in the mid-19th century on a dairy farm. And a river runs through the farm, which is sweet, gives sweet water, which makes the pasture good and good feeding for the cattle. So it's a great thing to have. Now I'd like to show you on my screen my book cover. This is it, Waireka. You can see the barn in the background, which shows that it's about a farm. And it's set in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is a long way away, particularly for us in the UK. It's 24 hours in a plane. And even for people in America, the nearest point is California, which would take 8 or 9 hours to get there. And that's now. But the time when Eliza, my heroine, was going, it would take 4 to 6 months. Now, how did Eliza come to go to New Zealand? Well, I've written a book. It's about my great uncle who went out to New Zealand in the 1850s and met a young lady on the ship which he married. But I have taken the story from the young lady's point of view, Eliza. Now Eliza, my heroine, lives in Scotland, in Glasgow, and the local Presbyterian minister is given a living in Wellington. There's Wellington, the bottom of the North Island. Now Wellington is now the capital city of New Zealand. Then it would have been a large town. And there were lots of new buildings, including churches, being built at the time, so they needed Presbyterian ministers, pastors, vicars to go out and run these churches. And the Reverend Reed accepts this living, he and his wife Jessie, but they have a young family, and so they need a nursemaid to go with them. Eliza is the perfect candidate for it because she's got experience in childcare and she's keen to travel. So Eliza goes out on a boat, a ship, because that's how you had to travel then, 4 to 6 months. Now, it wasn't as romantic as we often think on a sail ship, because for one thing, you were in close proximity with the other people. The people in the lower quarters, the cheapest class in steerage, didn't even have a cabin, so they were in very close proximity to one another. And if you did have a cabin, you would have to take your own furniture and have it nailed down to the floor. Imagine. But the other thing is, you were also in close proximity then. You can see it's not a very big area. So disease was rife, and dysentery, scarlet fever, various other diseases, particularly if you were young or old or vulnerable, you wouldn't often make it to your destination, and bodies would be dispensed over the side during the voyage. The other thing that you wouldn't get is very much fresh food. The fresh food was taken on at the start of the journey, fresh meat, fresh vegetables, and they might make maybe 1 or 2 stops on the way, but in 4 to 6 months, you can't imagine there would be that many stops. So a lot of the time you'd be living with preserved meats and biscuits and very unappetizing food. The other thing that was in short supply was fresh water. They would take on fresh water at the start of the voyage, but very soon that water became nasty and it had to be made more palatable with sugar and lime juice. But apart from these disadvantages of travelling by sail ship, there was the other disadvantage that you're crossing lots of continents and seas, and there would be storms at sea. Now, Eliza experiences 2 storms during the voyage, and I would like to read one example from my book of one of the storms. Now, this storm is the second she experiences in the Tasman Sea near Australia. The storms began first thing in the morning, just before Christmas Day, and didn't let up for nearly a week. Eliza had never spent such a miserable Christmas before. She had heard from various people that the Tasman Sea was particularly treacherous ordinarily, but with the added pressure of a recent earthquake, nothing could have prepared her for the violent onslaught of these storms. They magnified the previous storms several times over, with the ship not only pitching and rolling this time, but tossed about like it was made of matchwood, and no competition for the waves that seemed feet high. Indeed, these storms were so violent that even the crew members were suffering from seasickness. Holed up in their cabin, Eliza and the children were sick until they were no longer able to be, and then just lay on their beds feeling like death. "Will the storm stop soon, Lizzie?" complained Maria on the 3rd day. "I'm sure it will, dearie," said Eliza, with much more conviction than she felt. It was hard to comfort the children when she herself felt comfortless. She kept her thoughts to herself, however, and dared not tell the children that she feared for their very lives and could not now imagine ever seeing the coast of New Zealand. But fortunately for us, she does reach New Zealand and her destination, otherwise there would be no more story. And the Reverence Living is a church very similar to this, wooden because of the earthquake zone. And you can see the gravestones in the grounds of the church. Now, a lot of the gravestones at that time would have been of children and babies, because it was a very tough climate, hardly developed, and with no medicines or things available, and Maoris, skirmishes and wars. So it was a very difficult place to be in. But we've talked about Eliza meeting a farmer and a builder called Alistair on the ship. Now, Alistair had 2 particular skills. Not only was he a farmer, but he was able to build, which was very useful in the new country. They go to Tater at first, where he works in a sawmill building, but he is a farmer primarily, and he wants to have land. And the local Presbyterian minister, Robert Ewell, finds out about some land which is available, and it's in the Waireka. This is a windy area, but great pasturing country for cattle. And as they want to raise a dairy herd, it's a perfect place. But they have to cross the Rimatukas, a range of mountains, to get there. And they have to, now you can cross the Rimatukas by road, but then you would have to take your cart and probably camp overnight, as our heroine does. And while they're there, they have a sighting of this bird, the hui bird. Now, New Zealand at the time was full of loads of flightless birds because they had very few predators. There was no 4-legged animals before the European settlers arrived, and these birds were able to roam free. And the hui bird died out very soon, became extinct, because it has pretty white tail feathers. I don't know if you can see them in the picture, but the ladies love to wear these tail feathers in their hats. And so that's how the hui bird became extinct. But there were others like the moa and others that became extinct. Fortunately for us, the emblem of New Zealand, the kiwi, a bird the size of a hen, is still around. It was preserved. You can still see kiwis nowadays, but if you want to see one, you probably won't see one in the wild because they hunt at night. It's more likely you'll see one in a darkened room in a zoo. But they arrive there, and Alistair, being a builder, is able to build them eventually a 2-storey house, something similar to this, and a 2-storey barn like this one that my husband and I are pictured in. Now, the top would have been where the animals' food was stored, And below was where the cattle were milked. And Alistair was a bit of an innovator. He was the first to introduce herringbone stalls, zigzag stalls, which would get more cattle in so that more milking cows, and he could add to the herd. And eventually he would become someone who made butter and transported it between the two islands. That one has become a restaurant, as you can see. And the house that they would have lived in would have been something similar to this. This one is now a hotel and a wedding venue. Now, the Maoris were the indigenous people at the time who'd arrived in the 13th century from the eastern Polynesian islands in canoes, something similar to this one. And this man has got an ornamental spear, but at the time they would have had real spears because this was their land. They'd been there for over 500 years, and suddenly these European settlers had arrived, and they said that they would reward them, they would give them remuneration for their land, and that if they would give their allegiance to the Queen. But actually they were cheated and they didn't really get all the remuneration they could, or they should have done. There was a treaty signed in 1840 called the Treaty of Waitangi, but it was only 500 tribal leaders that actually signed this at the place Waitangi, and a lot of others didn't. So there were skirmishes and battles all over New Zealand. But fortunately for us, the Waireka was a largely peaceful place. And fortunately for our heroine and hero too. Well, that's just a few slides that show you a little bit about my book. And I'd love to answer any questions that you now have, or talk a bit more about the book and how you can get hold of it. But I hope you've enjoyed the slides, and I'll see you in the live event now. Thank you for listening. Bye.